In June, I finished 13 books across 5 genres. I did have one DNF, but I had not one, but 2 books of the month. Here's everything I read in June. Since this was such a full month, I'm going to jump in without any preamble. I am reviewing these by genre with chapters below if you want to skip around. Books of the month will be at the end. Let's start with 2 works of science fiction, which kind of straddle the line of science fiction and fantasy, starting with The Frugal Wizard's Handbook for Surviving Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second of his secret novels that were published last year, and I'm finally getting to these a year later. This is the one that was probably the most maligned, the one that had the lowest ratings, and I get it. Of everything I've read by Sanderson, I have a Sanders shelf over here of everything that I've read. This is probably ranked the lowest, but I enjoyed this book. There are a lot of elements that I found a lot of fun, and I think the illustrations were outstanding. More on that later. The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England is a story about time travel, where sometime in our near future, we can travel back in time to medieval England. But there's kind of a twist. You kind of travel back to a different dimension so that you can't mess up your current timeline, and you don't know what you're going to get. So you don't know if you're going to go back to medieval England where perhaps the Vikings have conquered, and it's a different experience than you would expect. So I found that premise very interesting. I also love the fact that the protagonist here, the main character who's telling the story, he has amnesia, so he doesn't know what's going on. So in many ways, just by knowing the title, you know a little bit more than the main protagonist. And I enjoyed the discovery that the protagonist had in this story. I think the issue is, as he starts to realize what's going on, he starts to remember his own past, it became a little less interesting. His own story, I think this is probably Sanderson's weakest characterization that he's done from what I've read, which is basically everything that Cosmere plus this. So overall, I can see why people didn't like this, but it had a solid ending with a couple of really cool sequences at the end. And overall, I don't regret my time with this book. And I will say that this edition is absolutely beautiful, and Steve Argyle's illustrations really added to it. I mean, sprinkled along, you had a lot of times just little things in the bottom here, and then you had bigger art pieces, which were just gorgeous. And then a lot of times when you were reading this specific handbook, you would have kind of little interjections of the handbook, which would look a little bit different and read a little bit different. So Steve Argyle contributed quite a bit to this volume. I would not have enjoyed it quite as much without his contributions, but I did like The Frugal Wizard's Handbook to Surviving Medieval England. I can't say medieval today. Medieval England by Brandon Sanderson. So the other work, which was science fiction but had some fantasy elements, was a self-published work called The Ancient Gate by R.S. Penny. And the way that this kind of straddled it is it's a sci-fi space opera, but one of the characters in one of the worlds, there's some things that are really more magic than science. So it felt very sci-fantasy in that regard. I really love the world building with this one because you got 2 very different worlds. Kind of the first third is told on this world where there's kind of these magical elements. And then the second third, we're on a different world that it's much more technology based. And you kind of saw the clash of these 2 worlds. I believe that Penny had written both of these worlds and both of these characters, kind of these dual protagonists, in different books before, because he mentioned in the foreword that you don't have to have any knowledge of these prior stories for this to work, and I didn't feel that you did. I felt that I fully understood both worlds very, very well. This is the first book in a trilogy, and I think it had a lot of elements that were great. The world building was fantastic, and I enjoyed the protagonist, especially the second protagonist. As she came along, I thought she had a lot more depth and enjoyed her story quite a bit. My biggest issue with this book, there's 2 things that I really struggled with. First was the ending. It ends so abruptly. There's like a space battle, and then about 2 paragraphs later, it just ends. There's zero closure, and I understand that it's the first in a series, so there's not going to be a great ending. But authors, would you please end your books? This book doesn't end. It just kind of like falls off a cliff, and it's not like it ends with a big cliffhanger or something like that sucks you in for the next book. It's just a kind of like abrupt ending. Oh, I'm going to stop here, and then the second book will pick up next. It's the second time this year I've run into a self-published work, unfortunately, that just didn't have an ending. So I struggled with that. And then I also struggled with the author has the propensity to kind of just tell and not show. For instance, we were told that one of these protagonists struggles with depression, which I think is a great theme to explore. I mean, you see a lot of mental health explored very, very well in a lot of modern fantasy tales, and I really enjoy that aspect. I mean, Sanderson has done that very well in the Stormlight Archive. But we were kind of told that this character had depression, with the exception of kind of just one little scene, we were never shown it. So I really struggled with that. So the book was kind of okay for me. I won't continue the series. I think there's a lot of promise there. I liked the writing itself. But overall, The Ancient Gate is not a series that I'm going to continue, although I would consider the author in the future. Let's go next into the horror genre and talk about You Like It Darker by Stephen King. This is King's latest. I already did a full overview type of review for this. I'm going to be doing that for all of Stephen King's short fiction output, where I break down all of the different components of the stories, how many are in there, how many are short stories, novellas. In the case of this one, we have 10 short stories, we have 2 novellas. This is the book that I will point to when people say, all Stephen King's lost it. He has not lost it. This is a very strong collection. It's pretty dark, but there are 5 of the 12 stories that are absolutely superb. The 2 novellas are outstanding. I just marvel at, in these short stories, it just showcases how well King is at just characterization, because he can bring a character to life in such a short story that some authors can't do in an entire book series. And it's really highlighted here in You Like It Darker. It's a very strong collection, probably one of the best things that King has put out in the last 5 years. So if you haven't read King's short fiction, this is probably a good entry point. May not be the strongest of all of his 10 or 12 short story collections, but it is a very strong one. I really enjoyed You Like It Darker by Stephen King. Let's go next to a work of magical realism called No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbell. This is a book that was almost a masterpiece for me, and I actually felt frustrated at the end because it wasn't a masterpiece. No Gods, No Monsters it's a modern story where monsters are suddenly come to life. In the initial stages of this book, it's werewolves. But in this book, the monsters are really kind of a stand-in for the more marginalized people in our society. And I found that theme just brilliant, and I thought it was so well done, especially in the first third of this book. And in the last third of this book has a brilliant ending. I love the way that he wrapped up that theme, and I love the overall trajectory of this book. The problem was the middle of this book, he tried to throw so many other things in there. He was trying to throw like physics and biology and multiverse, and just he's trying to throw all these things in there that what it did is it just resulted in a very disjunct storytelling. And I felt that if he would have just focused on what this book was really about, this could have been like a 5-star read, book of the year type material for me. This is one of those polarizing books. It's like a 3.6 or a 3.8 in GOODREADS. And there are people that I've seen that say it's the masterpiece that I hoped it would be, but I'm not one of those. It was very good. I don't regret my time with it. This is an author I will definitely keep my eye on and will read more of Cadwell Turnbell. But this one, I think it just fell a little bit short for me. But it was good. I love the themes in it. You may as well. Judge for yourself, because a lot of people do love No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbell. Next up is a work of crime fiction and a reread for me, and that's A Drink Before the War by Dennis Lehane. This is Lehane's first novel, and the first novel to feature Kenzie and Gennaro, the detective team. I'm rereading a lot of these because I have plans of doing later this year a big kind of retrospective of Lehane's works. He's an author that I love, but I found that when I was thinking about that video, some of the ones I've read less recently, I need to just kind of revisit. So I started at the beginning with A Drink Before the War. And this is such a strong beginning to this writer's career. In this, we have it's a mystery where it starts off as just Kenzie Gennaro trying to find someone who's missing, and this missing person, and ends up turning into a murder mystery. But it's not a cookie-cutter murder mystery. The thing that I love about Lehane so much is he incorporates so much of the societal things that impact the crimes into these stories. And it just, for me, just has a greater depth than it's just a cookie-cutter Criminal Minds type story of the week. And what we get in here, which is so fantastic, is this story just envelops all of society. It impacts congressmen all the way down to kind of, street criminals. And it's a serpentine plot that has a really fine resolution, a really dark resolution. The thing that I like with Lehane is it's very gritty, but it feels real. It really reminds me of the great crime television that I love, like The Wire, The Shield. It doesn't go too far over the top, and it just feels very, very real and very gritty to me. Drink Before the War is a fantastic debut. It would be a great entry point to this author if you're interested in that, in reading this author, because Lehane is a master, and Drink Before the War is a masterpiece of his works. Maybe not his best work, but it's better than 90% of crime fiction out there. Usually these cuts between genres are just kind of quick to just save time. And then there's the times where I can't say crime friction. Friction, see, I did it again. I keep saying crime friction. I want to say, let's go from crime fiction to true crime nonfiction. So let's go with this. This is Roll Red Roll by Nancy Shortman. Rape, power, and football in America's heartland. I already did a dedicated video about this book where I discussed kind of the themes that go on in this. This is a book that is about a high school girl who was raped by members of a celebrated football team, high school football team. The reason I read and reviewed and discussed this book is it happened in my hometown, unfortunately. It's a very fine book about a very hard topic to discuss. So if you want to hear more about that book, check out that video. It's kind of a sobering read. Doesn't leave you with a lot of hope. Anyway, just go check out that video. But I think it's a strong book, and this is one of the finest nonfiction works I've read this year, Roll Red Roll by Nancy Shortman. All right, let's go next into the fantasy genre. Let's start with the DNF. I don't DNF that often. This is the first, I think, might be the second book I've DNF'd this year. And it's a self-published work, unfortunately. It's The Shadow of Theron by Catherine Troy. And the reason I DNF this, I can call it more not for me than did not finish, because it was evident, I DNF'd in chapter 9, that I'm not the audience for this book. It started off with a lot of promise for me. You have a kind of a masked Avenger that is defending kind of the lower aspects of society, so total Zorro vibes, and it's in a fantasy world. I was initially liking this protagonist at the beginning who's kind of a noble, and then he puts on the mask and becomes this persona, this Zorro-like persona, and I was really intrigued in where it was going. Additionally, I really like the writing. I like the writing a lot. It's a writing style that just doesn't draw attention to itself. And that may seem like a backhanded compliment, but it's not. It flows really, really well. I don't notice the writing because it's pretty strong. However, it was obvious that this was turning into a romantasy. And we had kind of some insta-love of this character who was just indifferent to, getting married, that kind of thing. And then we have insta-love, and then we have the courting, and it's very awkward. And chapter 9, when he was cooking with his love, I just realized this is not the book for me. I mean, I'm someone that just has no interest in Sarah J. Maas or Fourth Wing or those kinds of books, and I think this is along that vein. So if you're interested in romantasy, I think that's where this book was going, but I was groaning out loud in chapter 9 when the characters started cooking together. Just realized it's just not for me. But again, the writer has skill, and I think for the right audience, this will be a great book. I'm just not that audience. Let's go next into something where I am the audience, and this is Quest for Lost Heroes by David Gemmell. Heroic fantasy from the 80s, early 90s. I wish I'd discovered this author sooner. Some authors, I think, had I discovered them sooner, I might not have appreciated them as much, but I would have loved Gemmell had I been reading these when they came out. But I still love them. Quest for Lost Heroes is the fourth in the Drenai saga. Although the timeline is kind of all over the place, it's kind of the third one in the chronology. It really serves as not really a sequel, but it happens after The King Beyond the Gates. And it has my two favorite things in fantasy. My two favorite fantasy tropes are the quest and the fellowship. That's why I love Fellowship of the Ring so much. Quest for Lost Heroes has both of those. But there's a darker edge to this. And there are times in this, it was real dark. I mean, two sequences in general, I was just like, damn, this is grimdark. But overall, it's heroic fantasy. And what I loved about this book, as in some of his other books, it starts small and ends up being something that is just something that encompasses the entire world. It's not just this small tale, but it has just global ramifications. And I loved every minute of this. Fast read. I mean, these Gemmell books go down really fast, but I find that there's a lot of depth. There's depth of character. There's depth of theme. The story just flows. There's no fat. It's plotted superbly. Quest for Lost Heroes is fantastic. These Gemmell books, they're 3 for 4 for me so far. And when I say 3 for 4, like 3 of these are 5-star reads as far as I'm concerned, as far as me being a great audience for this. But if you haven't read any Gemmell, pick up Legend or Waylander. Those are probably the best entry points. But Quest for Lost Heroes is a great one in this series as well. Let's go next into something very different for me, and this is The Lays of Beleriand. This is the 3rd volume in the History of Middle-earth by J.R.R. Tolkien and compiled by Christopher Tolkien. This is chunky. There are 5 of them in here. I'm going to set it down. So The Lays of Beleriand is a very different book because a lay is a narrative poem, and this is about 370 pages of narrative poems. It's been at least 20 years, if not 30 years, since I've read a collection of poetry that this is. So I struggled at first, but I thought back to when I was forced to read poetry in high school. What I found for me worked really well is if I read it out loud. So with all of these narrative poems, what I did is I read them out loud until I found kind of the internal rhythm, and then I was able to read it silently in my head, reading it in that rhythm. And what I found was a lot of beauty. Now, I didn't always understand everything. I mean, poetry is the most purple of prose you can get. At times, I just found it beautiful. At times, I found it beautiful, and I knew what was going on. And I think that's where I realized that Christopher Tolkien's work here is invaluable. Not only in compiling these things, because a lot of times the single poem would be written in different places, oftentimes like on the back of a menu or things like that. He did so much work in putting these things together. But then also his commentary at the end of each one of these lays, I think, is invaluable in just explaining what is going on for the times where I just found it beautiful but didn't necessarily understand textually or even in the subtext what was going on. But even beyond that, the thing that I just continue to gain a greater appreciation of is just Tolkien himself. Just the depth of the work that he did to put together his 2 stories. And that's why, yes, I'm going to be judgmental. Anytime I see a modern reader poo-poo Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings, I just know that they're wrong. It's plain and simple. Because there's just so much more depth in these stories that people just don't appreciate, unfortunately. Now, these History of Middle-earth volumes, they're tough. I mean, 370 pages of narrative poems is going to be toughest for most people. If you're not a completionist like me, I don't know if I could recommend it, but I found a lot of beauty in it. I found a lot of value in it, and I look forward to continuing in the 4th volume of History of Middle-earth at some point, maybe later this year. Next up is King of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. This is the 2nd book of the Broken Empire trilogy. I was a little nervous going into this one because I didn't love the 1st book, but there were enough aspects of the 1st book that I did enjoy. I wanted to see where the story went, and I'm glad I did because I think this is a decided step up from the 1st book. I continue to love the world, and the things that you thought that were alluded to in the world in the 1st book, it's confirmed right away when you see the map, because you see the bigger picture of the map here and you see, oh yeah, that's exactly what's going on. So I enjoy that aspect. If that's vague, it should be, because you need to read it to find out. The biggest complaint I think I had with the 1st book was characterization, and I think that was greatly improved here. I still don't like the main character, narrator, Jorg. I probably never will. I mean, there's only one more book with him, so it's kind of late for me to be really enjoying this character. But I felt, unlike the 1st book, that the secondary characters had a lot more depth and a lot more nuance. I felt in the 1st book, maybe because it was Jorg, very young, and he's the narrator, and he's a sociopath, so secondary characters don't matter to him, so maybe that's the reason that they were not finely drawn, but I felt in this book that there was a lot more depth to them, not only from Jorg, but from, there's a kind of a cheat. We get the journal that we're reading of another character that explains some of these other characters, and I think adds a lot of depth to the story as well. My biggest complaint, though, still is that Mark Lawrence's writing is beautiful, but I don't think that Jorg is capable of such beauty. So a lot of times when I'm reading this beautiful passage, I'm thinking, man, this guy can write. And then I realize it's supposed to be at the pen of this 18-year-old sociopath, and I find a bit of a disconnect. Now, perhaps this is Jorg at age 60 penning this tale. I don't know. That wasn't really clearly drawn out for me at any point in either of these books. But I still find that disconnect, and it kind of takes me out of my immersion in the story. But this book had a fantastic ending. There was a plot twist that, I'm pretty good at plot twists, and this one just gobsmacked me when I got to it, and it was really, really brilliant. But overall, I enjoyed this one a lot more than the first one, and it has me frankly excited to read the next one in the series, which will happen July or August most likely. But I did enjoy King of Thorns, and I'm looking forward to the conclusion, Emperor of Thorns. And one more that I squeezed in the fantasy genre at the end of the month was Conan the Triumphant by Robert Jordan. This is the 5th one of the 2 omnibus collections. He wrote 7 books following Robert E. Howard's Conan the Cimmerian. And I think he continues the legacy very, very well. This was a strong one. It was plotted very well. There's no fat. Those of you that know Wheel of Time, Jordan often just goes on and overly describes things and kind of takes his time. But these Conan stories are plotted really, really quickly and done very well. I mean, it's only 250 pages. It goes down very quickly. My biggest complaint with these, and it's kind of a trigger warning for some people, is even in the Robert Howard stories, Conan has a very strong male gaze, shall we say. And Jordan, it's the male gaze on steroids. And I've come to it where I just laugh at it because I find it humorous, and I just keep thinking, Robert, go take a cold shower, man. But if that bothers you, don't pick these up. But if you want some, I won't say mindless, but some fantasy where you don't have to think a lot, and you want something that goes down quickly, that's just sword and sorcery fare, these Conan stories are fine. I really liked Conan the Triumphant. I have one more in these omnibus of Robert Howard. God, I'm confused again. Of Robert Jordan to continue with. But I'm enjoying them. They're great kind of palate cleanser fantasy. So if you don't like that, one trigger warning, maybe avoid. But if you want kind of some simple fantasy, I can recommend all of these Conan stories. And Conan the Triumphant is probably one of the stronger ones in this collection. All right, my first book of the month is Waylander by David Gemmell. I saw a blogger, and I wish I'd written it down so I could give them credit. I saw a blogger saying that they thought this was better than Legend. And I think it could be. I think it's equally as good. I think it's also a great entry point. The Waylander stories, I think there's 3 of them with this main character, maybe 2. They happen well before Legend. So I'm reading publication order, which frankly I wish I hadn't, but the publication order is kind of all over the place. So this happens well before, but I did know enough of the world that I realized that partway through when I kind of heard what was going on with some of the world. But this is a great entry point. And Waylander is such a flawed hero. And this is heroic fantasy, but he's really an anti-hero. Waylander himself, he's a king killer, he's an assassin. But he has kind of this moral code that makes him go off on this adventure. And throughout this adventure, he meets a lot of people. And there's even times where they question, like, you're an assassin, you're this kind of person, why are you doing this? And Waylander doesn't even know. So there's a bit of self-discovery with his character that I really enjoyed. There are a few Deus Ex Machina scenes in here that I could see people complaining about them, but he sets them up. He sets them up enough where when they happen, they're plausible. But I love the story, and I love the growth of this character throughout the story, and I absolutely loved how it ended. I mean, picture perfect landing. And I also enjoy, Gemmell gives you like a page to 2 pages of an epilogue at the end where he just kind of tells you what happens with all the characters. And I appreciate that just a little bit at the end. It gives you a little bit more closure than where the story ended. Even if it says that this person was lost to history. We don't know what happened to them afterwards. But I really enjoyed Waylander. And again, I mean, you'll see when I talk about my next book of the month, you'll recognize how strong a book this is, that I couldn't not make it a book of the month because of the next book, which is also my book of the month. The second book of the month is The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong. This is one of the most successful works of self-published fantasy out there. This was a special edition. I think it's sold several thousand copies and sold out. Gorgeous edition. I mean, sprayed edges. There's great art within. And this story is fantastic. First of all, the world building is what I love most. It's a very Japanese-inspired fantasy. And not just with the naming conventions, but with a lot of the culture in it is very Japanese-inspired. This is also a fantasy that has some science fiction elements, which you discover along the way. I liked the kind of unorthodox structure to this, where the main conflict, at least the main kind of physical battle conflict, is not like 80-90% into the book. It's about 60 to 70% in the book. So you get a lot of falling action, but for me, the falling action in many ways is what this book is about. Because we get a female character who's our main character here. We get a lot of great characters here, but the main character here, she was a warrior until she got married, and you can't be a warrior when you're supposed to be a mother. But the circumstances in this book, she has to kind of rely upon that. And she has to, in many ways, contradict her society when these things happen partway through this book. And in many ways, it's her dealing with that, her husband dealing with that, and society dealing with kind of some societal changes that are happening because of what happens in this book. Additionally, there's a scene in here that, there's twice in this book where I was in tears, but there's a scene that hit me in the stomach, and I couldn't believe what had happened in here. This is some bold storytelling and some different storytelling that, frankly, I don't know if would have been possible if this were traditionally published. And that's one thing I love about self-published fiction, is that they can often do things that are a little unorthodox, a little different. Now, there are a couple missteps in the final chapter. I think she was trying to tie this into maybe a series that she was going to write or something like that didn't seem to make sense, and it was kind of a bloated chapter. But with the exception of that, this is a contender for my book of the year, as is Waylander. But this is just every accolade you've heard people talk about. This is my favorite self-published fantasy. This is my favorite fantasy standalone. The people that are saying that, I don't think they're being hyperbolic, because this is fantastic. I want to thank Joanna for picking this for me. We had our Fireside Discord TBR choice, and she chose this for me. I thought at the time it was a very thoughtful choice, and she made a great choice, because I love this book. I'll reread this book. I will read this author, whatever she writes next. I can't wait to read. But The Sword of Kaigan, along with Waylander, is my book of the month for June 2024, and I highly, highly recommend you pick it up. Well, another long monthly wrap-up. My apologies. 13 books. I went as fast as I could. I'd love to hear what your book of the month was, and I'd love to hear of this huge stack of books I have here. If you've read any of those, I'd love to talk with you in the comments section below. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Till next time, goodbye.